Hello, and welcome to another episode of Her Head in Films. I'm Caitlin, and I'm your host. On this podcast, I share my thoughts and feelings about the films that I watch. They tend to be art house and world cinema. What makes this podcast unique is that I weave together my life experiences with an in-depth discussion of the films that I love. I explore the impact that cinema has on me and why I connect so deeply to it. As I like to say, my head isn't in the clouds, my head is in films. I'm so excited to bring you today's episode. It's all about Jem Cohen's 2012 film Museum Hours. What's so special about this episode is that I have a guest on. I talked to Carolyn Petit. She's managing editor at Feminist Frequency. We had a really amazing, wide-ranging, deep discussion about this film. We talk about all kinds of facets of it. So if you haven't seen Museum Hours, I highly recommend that you watch it. But I do want you to know that we talk about certain things in the film and it may be spoiled for you. Museum Hours is this little perfect, amazing film. It's about two strangers who forge a bond after meeting at a Vienna art museum. It's a beautiful film. It's meditative. Carolyn and I talk about art and human connection and so many other things. I loved talking to her about this film, and I loved revisiting this film, rewatching it for this episode. I hope that you'll listen to the full episode, and I hope that you will definitely get something out of it. Her Head in Films has a Patreon where you can financially support the podcast and the work that I'm doing on a monthly basis and access all kinds of rewards and extras, including bonus episodes and merchandise. You can find out more information at patreon.com/herheadinfilms. That's patreon.com/herheadinfilms. At one level, you get a shout out on each episode. So I love to give a shout out to my wonderful patrons Kelsey, Aaron, Rachel, Tyler, Max, Juan, Iris, Teal, JD, Vanessa, Spunden, Polina, Olivia, Carolyn, Jesse, Feminist Overlord, Michelle, and Lindsay. Thank you all so much for being patrons. You're wonderful, and I'm so grateful to have your support. But if financial support is not an option for you, and I definitely understand if it isn't, please consider reviewing the podcast on iTunes and or Stitcher. If you write a review on iTunes, I will share it on a future episode of the podcast, and I'll leave out your name to protect your privacy. If you love Her Head in Films, consider telling your friends or your followers on social media. Spread the word. Sharing is caring when it comes to podcasts. It can be kind of difficult to get listeners, to get people interested. So please don't underestimate what tweeting about an episode does, or sharing it on Facebook, or talking about it on Instagram. Those things can help, and it can get me more listeners, which is what I ultimately would love, because I just want to share my love of cinema with as many people as possible and maybe inspire them. I've gotten some really great messages over the last few months about some of you who you listen to episodes and it inspires you to seek out the films that I talk about, and maybe it just inspires your own journey through cinema. And I love that. And I love not being an authority. This is just a starting point. My thoughts are not the be-all, end-all for these films. So I love the idea that some of you actually go out and watch the films and have your own experience, because there's no substitution. There's no substitute for watching these films for yourself and forming your own opinions and your own relationship with the films. So I absolutely love that. And if you want to send me messages or make positive comments or interact with me on social media, I would love that. That's another thing you can do that's totally free, because I happen to be a really insecure person. And it really helps me to hear those things. It just boosts me. It raises my spirits. It reminds me why I'm doing this, why I'm putting so much time and work and effort into Her Head in Films. Because sometimes I get down, and sometimes I feel like a failure, and sometimes I struggle. So when I get messages from those of you who listen, that's like a tangible, concrete thing that shows me that I'm having some kind of impact in the world. And that's really all I've ever wanted my entire life. All I've ever wanted is just to matter and to create. That's what I've always wanted. And so when you message me when you do that, you give me that. You let me know that I'm having some kind of effect, some kind of ripple in the world. And that means everything to me. I'm on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Just search for Her Head in Films and I should pop up. You can see links to all my social media accounts listed in the show notes of each episode. I will stop rambling on and let's just dive right into my conversation with Carolyn about museum hours. I hope you like it. I'm excited to share it with you and I'm so glad that we had our conversation. So here it is. Today, I'm joined by Carolyn Petit. She's managing editor at Feminist Frequency, and she's also the co-host of the weekly podcast Feminist Frequency Radio. Hello, Carolyn. Thank you so much for joining me.
Hi, Caitlin. Well, it's such a pleasure. I'm a tremendous fan of the podcast, and so it's a real thrill for me to be here with you to talk about a film that I love so much today.
Yeah, I'm really happy to have you. When I started thinking about having guests, you were definitely high on my list because you've listened to the podcast a long time. And I always felt like we had a lot in common, when it came to film and the way we approach film and the kinds of cinema that we watch. So I'm really glad that you agreed to be on here. I just want to ask you a few questions before we get into our discussion of museum hours. First, I would just love you to tell more about yourself and sort of introduce yourself to the listeners.
Sure. So my name is Carolyn Petit. I sort of came into professional criticism through video games, actually, and I used to work as an editor for a major kind of video game site called GameSpot. During my time at GameSpot, where as a trans woman in the video game cultural space, I faced a fair amount of pushback, and there were certain elements of our readership that weren't thrilled to just have to see or listen to a trans woman's opinion on the regular, which I knew going in would be a factor, but I wasn't about to let that stop me. But during my time there, an organization called Feminist Frequency began a project looking at representations of women in video games from a feminist perspective, and it's a video series called Tropes versus Women in Video Games, and through a set of circumstances that I won't go into detail for right now, but I eventually wound up working at Feminist Frequency on those videos because it was a project that I felt was so important, and I definitely saw the need for feminist criticism of video games because I was aware that sexism and misogyny were such a problem, not only in the content of video games, but in the culture surrounding video games. But film has actually, always been a great love of mine too, and not one that I've really gotten to focus on sort of publicly or professionally. But so whenever I have the opportunity to really discuss film, certainly, films that I love, I'm thrilled at the chance. So, so again, that's what brings me here today.
I really love the work that Feminist Frequency does. I've followed it for probably several years now, and even before I knew you, I definitely knew about Feminist Frequency, and I definitely love the work that you do on there. I know that you talk about films sometimes, like on Twitter and, different places like that. And of course, in the show notes of this episode, I'll definitely link people to where they can find you outside of our discussion if they would definitely like to follow you.
Great.
So I'm really glad that you're coming on and that you get to talk about cinema more and talk about film more, and that's really great. I would love to know, what are some of your early movie memories, like from your childhood or even beyond, and just some of your first memories?
Yeah, definitely. So growing up, my father was not a cinephile by any stretch, but there were certain kinds of films that appealed to him, particularly films that involved like technology, science fiction films, and anything that had anything to do with cars. So I was taken with him. I was taken by him to a lot of films when I was very young. Films that I was definitely too young at the time to like emotionally process or handle, and that had images that left these sort of indelible impressions on me. One of them I remember was this sort of political techno thriller, War Games. It stars, Matthew Broderick, and the film has an extremely, at least for like a 6-year-old child, has an extremely intense opening scene involving gigantic nuclear missiles almost being fired, and there's just the emotion is extremely between these two men. Is extremely heated, and weirdly, I the experience was not what I would call. I'm fumbling for a word here. It's not what I would call traumatic, but it was just overwhelming, like emotionally and psychologically overwhelming. I was definitely, I think, too young to like process it, and so the images just, again, there was something about the images from that film that became kind of burned into my mind in a very powerful way. Another film that I was taken to at a much too young an age was it's John Carpenter's adaptation of the Stephen King horror film Christine, which is about like a killer car. Yeah. And I remember certain jump scares and just moments from that film just sort of terrifying me, and again, just images becoming extremely just etched into my mind. But at the same time as there were these experiences at the movie theater, where these just larger than life, overwhelming experiences, I also remember at home, my father would just sometimes have on in the home a film like 2001, which is an extremely sort of visual film, and that film, and something like or Blade Runner, which is also just an extremely like visual film. And on the television, these were a size that I could sort of handle, and I think that being around films like that just are so fascinating visually probably instilled in me at a young age in a way that I wasn't even really aware of then, a kind of appreciation or a fascination with the visual imagery of cinema and what that can do.
It's interesting to me how your early experiences with cinema are like not traumatic necessarily, but very maybe visceral.
Yes, that's a good word.
Yeah, and this sense that you were consuming images that you couldn't understand at that age. It reminds me of how cinema, about representation, and how cinema really shapes us from a very early age, like the power of this art form, for better or worse, that, a lot of people don't always want to talk about the representation of women or minorities, but when you think about what you're consuming as a child, 5, 6 years old, I myself remember watching films maybe with sexual content in them as a little girl I maybe was not prepared for.
Sure.
Because I had a TV in my room when I was little, and my parents couldn't, this was the 90s. My parents couldn't control that I might put it on a channel that had maybe a provocative film on.
Definitely.
Or a film with violence in it. And I think about sometimes how those films shaped me, really, how they shape all of us and in what we think about certain things.
Yeah, and I think, that there are ways in which we can think about that critically, in terms of representation. Mm-hmm. And then there's also, I think, another level just that's almost sort of the dreamlike or subconscious sort of level where, again, like these images just of, in my case, like these, the neon lit future Los Angeles of Blade Runner, that maybe became like fuel, I think, for like my imagination in some ways, right?
Yeah,
like there's also that.
There's good and bad. Yeah,
Exactly.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I also wanted to say, like, it seems like you really started out with, like, grand films. Like, when I was that age, I was, like, watching The Little Mermaid.
Sure, but I'm
And
not.
it's so
Yes.
interesting, yeah.
Well, I'm not. I mean, these are not films that so those films specifically, like Blade Runner or 2001 and films like that, are not films that I was, like, sitting down to watch. Rather, they were films that, like, images, they might be just on in the background, and they'd leave this impression on me because certainly, like, if I was watching stuff around that time, it would have been probably, of course, like, I saw Star Wars a lot when I was a kid. I remember we had HBO at home, and when I was quite young, like, Star Trek 2 was just a movie that was, like, that they showed on HBO all the time. And I think at a certain point, like kids do, if it was on, even if I'd seen it like 6 or 7 times, I just wanted to watch it again to kind of absorb, because there's something comforting when you're a kid about knowing, like, the story beats and just the familiarity of seeing something for the umpteenth time. So there were films I was watching that were kind of within my grasp in terms of the narrative and everything, and then there were other films that were more like these kind of abstract experiences that I couldn't wrap my head around, but that nonetheless had some kind of lasting impact on me.
Yeah, I love that you were sort of experiencing those films at that age. That's really interesting. And yeah, it's just a reminder of that like the magic of cinema and just that power it can have over us. These images, how they become just part of our minds, and I love how you talk about it activated your imagination. I mean, that is a powerful aspect of film, I think. I really do.
Definitely.
And I just wanted to ask you briefly, like, have you revisited some of those films from your childhood?
Yeah, sure. I mean, Blade Runner, when I was, like, in my late teens, early 20s, Blade Runner was a film certainly that I watched quite a bit. I think Blade Runner for a lot of people is sort of like a part of a gateway film to sort of thinking about film more as like an art form, or at least aesthetically. Though it does, I think, have some fascinating themes too of about humanity and what makes us human and things like that. So and that film in particular was a film that later, when I was in high school, there was like a director's cut that was released, and it was put in cinemas again, and so I went to see it in the cinema, and that was a kind of a big experience for me, many years later, finally getting to sort of see it on the big screen, which for a film like that, which again is so visually detailed and sumptuous, there's so much to like take in and appreciate about the kind of just the world that the film creates visually. That was a real pleasure for me later on.
I actually haven't seen it, but I know that people love the Blade Runner and the newer one that was made, and there's been a lot of talk about those films for sure.
Sure.
So I would love to know what you feel like sparked your passion for cinema, or maybe the film or the films that really made you see it more as an art form, and where that passion started.
Yeah, definitely. So when I was in college, I studied theater, studied acting. Me and a good friend of mine would sort of rent and watch films that were kind of off the beaten path. Not the films that so much that maybe our peers were really like excited about or into, but films that we were interested in, maybe because they had an actor that we really admired or were interested in what was an acclaimed performance or something. So, for instance, I remember us at one point like renting the William Hurt film The Doctor, because we both liked William Hurt a lot as an actor, and kind of watching the film for the joy of like seeing his performance in the film. And that was certainly not a film that like anyone around us at school would have cared about.
I've not heard of it. Yeah. Very obscure.
It's. I mean, it was,
at least.
when it came out, it definitely was. It was like a well respected kind of art house film But yeah, and so, as the two of us, of course, graduated at a certain point and our lives moved on, but we continued to kind of seek out, we are just interest in film, our interest in film continued to go beyond just like the sort of mainstream hits, whatever the kind of big action films or the big like films were. And I think we both were voracious readers of film criticism. We loved like just reading reviews, and we developed appreciations for certain critics that we really liked. It was around that time that I became pretty enamored with Manohla Dargis, who's now a critic for the New York Times. But, when I lived in Los Angeles at the time. For quite a while, she was a great critic at a publication there called the LA Weekly. And she moved into the LA Times. And so, reading her was a very kind of stimulating experience. Even when I disagreed with her, her work always gave me a lot to think about. So that relationship, the reading of film criticism kind of helped me appreciate film more deeply, and so then I'd go to films and they'd give me things to think about, and then I'd take what I'd seen in films back to my reading of film criticism, and it was just this really rewarding, and stimulating relationship. Yeah, so it was, it was kind of, I'd say it really started to evolve in like the years right after college, through going to some of the art houses in LA, sometimes seeing like foreign cinema and reading some great film criticism at the same time.
Do you have any desire to be a film critic at all, or to do more film writing?
I'm not sure, I have tremendous admiration for great film criticism and great film appreciation. Certainly it's something that I've thought about at times, but I haven't explored it enough to know if I feel like I really have something to say in that space, that I can do work that I would feel proud of, or that I would feel was valuable in that space. So it's not something that I've really really pursued yet, or off course, or given too much thought to.
I was just curious because I do enjoy your writing, when you write about films, like on your Tumblr and things like that. Like when you've written about Call Me by Your Name, for instance,
sure.
Or you wrote about Desert Hearts, and I incorporated that into my own review, my own episode about the film, and so that's just why I asked, because I do enjoy your writing on film.
Thank you very much. And of course, yes, occasionally there are films that just live inside of me so intensely that I feel like, oh my God, I have to say something about this film. And when that happens, of course, I love to write about film, but whether it's something that I would want to do more consistently, I don't really know yet.
Okay. What are some of your favorite films? I would love to know.
It's one of those questions that I think, you could ask me one day and I'll come up with, say 5 movies, and you might ask me the next day and I'll be in a different emotional space, a different mental space, and I might have 5 other films for you. I would say certainly, Casablanca is just, for my money, Casablanca might be the most sort of purely entertaining kind of Hollywood film of all time. Just sort of, if we're talking like sort of mainstream, like studio stuff, for me, it doesn't get any better than Casablanca. I adore that film.
Yeah, me too.
I was thinking earlier today about Blue is the Warmest Color, which is a film that, of course, has its what we'd call, extremely like problematic elements, and we can't sort of ignore that or pretend that they're not there. And yet, I find that the emotion, the performances in that film, the emotion of the story, the way that it observes its characters in just moments of life is so powerful to me. It's a film that at the end, I'm just left speechless by the 2 lead performances, and by the just how much I feel like I've been on this emotional transformative journey with the main character of Adele. But then, on the sort of like the other side of that coin, there's a Swedish film called Kiss Me. So the Swedish spelling is Kyss, me, MIG, but it's been released in English both under the name Kiss Me and under the name With Every Heartbeat. So depending on it makes it a little tricky, I guess, to like Google it, but you can find it. And this is another queer romance. It's a film about a love that develops between two women, and it's actually far, far more conventional than something like Blue is the Warmest Color. It feels kind of mainstream. It has a kind of traditional 3-act structure and everything. And for me, that's actually part of its power, is that it tells a queer love story, a story of love between two women, which traditionally is not the kind of story that mainstream films have told, although that's seemingly perhaps starting to change. And it does it in such by doing it in such a kind of mainstream or conventional way. It really seems to kind of to some degree normalize the story that it's telling. And also it has these if there's a big problem to me with Blue is the Warmest Color's love scenes, and that they feel so staged for the viewer. It is not a stretch for some viewers to criticize them as being sort of pornographic in their presentation. And by contrast, the love scenes in Kiss Me are so much about faces and hands and emotion, like walls collapsing or things like that. And as a result, they're far more, to me, powerful and kind of, sexy even than what we get in Blue is the Warmest Color. And so that's a film that's sort of like in a way, it's a comfort film. It's a film that I might just put on in the background if I'm doing other things at this point, but that's not to diminish it at all. Kiss Me is a film that I truly, that has a very kind of special place in my heart.
I actually have not heard of that film, so I will definitely look into it and, try to find it and get more information about it. And I did an episode about Blue is the Warmest Color, and
yes,
I definitely am on the same page with you about that film. Like, the thing is that I felt like the online criticism of the film almost affected the way that I reacted to it.
Sure.
I felt like I should reject it. I felt like,
right.
I shouldn't. It feels like that film, like you shouldn't admit that you love. But when you open yourself up to that film, for all its issues, and I agree about the sex, but I think it's also very unfair to reduce that film just to the sex.
I agree.
Yeah,
completely.
and I know you do. Yeah,
yeah.
And there is something deeply emotional about the film. There are textures, there's a sensuality, there's what Adele, the main actress, does, and what Lea Seydoux does as well. But especially Adele's performance. I haven't seen anything like it.
No.
The way she carries that film and the way she conveys certain emotions, they resonated with me, not just in terms of that, but like class. She's working class, and that was something I could really relate to. And there's just so many layers to that film, and so every time you watch that film, you feel like you have an experience.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I love Casablanca too. That was a film I saw very early on when I was getting interested in cinema and art house. And I just, I think it made me fall in love with Ingrid Bergman forever. I just love Ingrid Bergman.
Me too.
Deeply.
Oh, absolutely.
Oh my gosh. Her on screen, her skin, her beauty, but also her acting and just everything about that woman. I love Ingrid Bergman. But I will definitely check out Kiss Me and try to learn more about that film. It sounds really good. It does. So finally, I just want to ask you if recently you have seen any films that you just really love and that you want to talk about or mention.
Sure. I think that this year has been particularly vital and important for Black filmmakers and films that kind of focus on Black experiences. The film Sorry to Bother You by Boots Riley is a tremendously surreal and strange film, but it's also, in my mind, exactly the kind of film we need politically right now in terms of its concerns with labor, its concerns with just with labor, with racism, with those kinds of cultural issues. Alongside that, there's Black Klansman by Spike Lee, which is a film that I agree very strongly with. So Boots Riley, the director of Sorry to Bother You, criticized Black Klansman quite strongly for, in a lot of ways, for not being critical it's a film about white supremacy, and it's a film about specifically the KKK and David Duke, but it's ultimately it's not inherently critical of police institutions. And so I agree very much with Boots Riley, who criticized the film for kind of letting police institutions off the hook, or for even maybe kind of glorifying them to some degree. And yet the way that BlacKkKlansman makes its connections between what was happening in the film's sort of like early 70s era about, this black police officer in Colorado Springs who infiltrates the KKK, and what's happening in the country right now today with regard to white supremacy becoming more overt, more emboldened in its existence. Certainly it's always been there. It's never gone away. It's at the core of this country's history. And but yeah, I mean, I walked out of BlacKkKlansman kind of shattered by the impact of it in a lot of ways. So yeah, I guess those are the films that that I've seen sort of this year that I feel like it's important to mention, given the historical moment that we find ourselves in.
Yeah, more films that I need to see. There's just so much out there. There's so much to see. But yeah, those sound very relevant and of the moment, and we need more films like that. Those are very important. Now we can talk about museum hours. I just want to talk a moment about revisiting the film, because it's probably been a few years since both of us originally saw it. It came out in 2012, and I just wanted to, I guess, we can share our memories, like the first time we saw it and then what it was like to rewatch it. I do remember that I saw it in 2013, and I don't totally remember the context of watching it, but it interested me. I'm attracted to films about art, about museums. I myself love art, and I actually haven't really been to a museum before, which is crazy, but I live in sort of a rural area, and there's just not a lot of stuff like that around where I live, but I'm fascinated by art and by museums, and I think that's probably what intrigued me about it and got me interested in it. And then when I saw it, I just was blown away by this little quiet film that not a lot of people talk about. And I'm just curious about, your first time seeing it as well.
Sure. I remember when it was initially released, and I didn't see it in the theaters, but I remember reading a review of it that was, very glowing, that said that this film was really something special. And I think, at a certain point, not too long after its release, it showed up on Netflix, and the Netflix algorithm, I think, just knows that I'm interested in that sort of thing. So the film kind of popped up in Netflix's like recommendations for me, and I actually saw it at I was sort of dog sitting at a friend's place. This couple that I'm friends with were out, they were out of town, and their home is it's not a large home, but it's certainly a lot more spacious than my apartment, and it's also a bit sort of unfamiliar to me. And so it was nighttime, it was dark. I had all the lights off, and I was watching this film, and the film itself is so quiet, right? Because it's so much of it takes place in a museum, and it's such a film about just looking and observing, and the feeling that I remember from that first viewing is of being in a space, where the house was so quiet as I was in it too, and quiet in a way that my apartment is never really quiet, because they live in a quiet, sort of very quiet, like residential area. It's a bit kind of remote and things, and so it almost felt to me as if the quiet of the museum, there's a particular kind of quiet that you can experience in a museum, this kind of not oppressive at all, but just a kind of heavy quiet, as people are like observing the paintings or just regarding the art and everything. And it was as if almost that quiet kind of extended out from the film and into the space around me. It was it was gently powerful in that way, I would say.
Wow, that's really beautiful, to think about how the film sort of affected your environment or reflected it in some way. And then rewatching it this year in 2018, 5 years later, I found that for me it really held up, that it was it was like the first time almost, really.
Yeah.
Because I don't have a great memory. So when 5 years go by, I'm really not going to remember a whole lot about a film, although certain things had stayed with me, certain images. And I love nowadays, especially just watching films about just ordinary people, how they can connect. I love films that are really infused with the rhythms of everyday life. And I also happen to revisit this film at a time when I'm struggling with depression right now. And I just found that the film at this particular moment in my life comforted me. And that my mind, like when I'm depressed, or I just in general, I struggle to concentrate. Like it's just something I struggle with. I guess it's connected to the modern world, to the internet, to social media, sort of the fragmentation of our lives nowadays, and how we're always on. We're always on devices. We're always on machines. And of course, I had to use my laptop to watch the film.
Sure.
So, I mean, I'm not against those things, obviously. My computer allows me to watch great films, but it's like, it was so nice to just watch this film and let the stillness of it, the quiet of it just sort of envelop me and sort of hold me and comfort me at a time when I needed it. The visual beauty of the film was just such a comfort to me. And I think also in this day and age, the times we're living in, it's like we need that reminder of human decency, of human kindness, of human connection. And when you're in depression, when you're in the depths, you can tend to forget that. And so this was a film for me that reminded me of that. So I felt like this film sort of came along at the right time for me. That doesn't always happen, but in this time in my life, it just kind of came along at a good time. I mean, what about you with revisiting it and rewatching it this year?
Yeah, absolutely. This is a film that, both times that I've watched it, it leaves me in a different headspace. It leaves me in a different emotional and mental space watching it, because it's so gentle, it's so slow, it's so, and I mean that not as a criticism, but as praise. Like, this film is wonderful in its slowness, and yes, it very much is a film that encourages you to notice the details of life around you and to kind of observe and to appreciate. And, so like as I was walking up the street this morning to this little coffee stand where I go to get a cup of coffee on a lot of mornings, I noticed I was like more inclined to, to appreciate little just details of the environment, that little, flowers, or just to kind of take it slow myself, to kind of just enjoy the walk, the leisureliness of the walk, and to really take my time. And yes, I think that is so valuable, as you say, right now, given the ways in which we are. Certainly I know that I am definitely, overstimulated by the internet, by Twitter, by things like this. I have a kind of, like a lot of people, I think I have a kind of addiction to these things to some degree. And that's not to say that they don't offer, good things in my life, that the connections that Twitter, offers are not sometimes valuable, right? That they definitely are. I think that sometimes Twitter can make me feel more connected and less lonely, but there is also a way in which this constant speed and stimulation and updating of things online can sort of rewire our brains in ways that are not conducive to us being in the moment, to being present, to being happy even, or fulfilled, or just comfortable in the moment. And so I was particularly aware of those aspects of Museum Hours, I think, after revisiting the film this week.
Yeah, it was the same for me. I mean, just today I was standing outside. I was just watching like the grass swaying in the wind. Or I was watching the trees, and I was like trying to be in the moment, in the present, and appreciate that and just live inside of that. And I was moved by the beauty of it, because nature is something that I just really love and is a big comfort to me. And it's important to reconnect with those things, I think. And I do think films like this can do that. And I've gotten much more interested interested in something called slow cinema. It's a real thing.
Mm-hmm.
There's a really great blog called The Art of Slow Cinema, and I'll put a link to it in the show notes of the episode. It's just this great blog that talks about films that are slower, and it's a real thing. It's like a movement, and not just slow cinema. I can't talk. Not just slow cinema. But I shared an article, I think on The Guardian recently, about slow reading.
Yes.
About people trying to like slow down and read, and like,
yes.
and that interests me. It's like there's this whole movement of like slowness that more people are getting interested in, and it can be helpful, and it can slow you down and just, put you back into the moment, back into the present. And so it's something, I mean, I'm not saying that I'm great at it. I'm not saying that I watch slow films all the time. Or I'm doing all of that 100% of the time. I'm on social media too much. But I think if we could be more aware of it and try to incorporate that into our lives, like, you don't have to watch a film like Museum Hours every single day or all the time.
Of course.
But it might be a good idea to try to watch something like this every now and then, or when you feel like you're in the space to appreciate it.
I agree completely. Yes.
Yeah, so I'm really glad that it just happened. I mean, we had planned to talk about this film. We didn't know exactly the way it would hit us, when the week came for us to talk about it. But it seems like it just it helped us in some way.
Yes, it was definitely a rejuvenating, there's something rejuvenating to me about this film. Or there was, this at this particular time, given the way that it observes connection and sort of celebrates human connection. It was, also was particularly, I think, valuable, for me right now.
Definitely. And so let's talk about the film.
Yeah.
I just want to briefly give people an idea, we're going to be talking about the film. I would obviously recommend people watch it before listening to the discussion. I don't know what we'll divulge, in the course of it, but it's set, I don't know if I'm going to pronounce this right.
I know.
But it's I went online and I tried. It's pronounced, I think, Kunsthistorisches. I don't know. It's so hard, but it's Kunsthistorisches Art Museum in Vienna, Austria. That is the setting. And there's not a lot of characters in this film. It's a man named Johann. He works at the museum as a guard, and there's a woman named Anne. She's from Montreal. Her cousin, Janet, lives in Vienna, Austria, and is in the hospital. She's basically in a coma. And so Anne goes over to Vienna to be with her cousin. They actually haven't talked in a long time, but Anne is really the only family that the doctors were able to find. And so Anne goes over there, and she's alone. She's in a city she's never been to, where she doesn't know the language. And she just happens to go into this art museum where Johann works, and the two of them connect with each other. And Johann really becomes a great comfort to her and a help to her, and shows great kindness to her, and the two of them hit it off. They have this connection, and that's really, there's not a lot of plot, that's kind of the gist of it, as it's really about Anne trying to deal with what's happening to Janet in the hospital, and it's about Anne and Johann opening up to each other. It's really about a friendship, and about two strangers connecting, and so that's pretty much the gist of it. It sort of reminded me a bit, like, I know you've tweeted a bit about, like, the Before trilogy, like Before Sunset.
Yeah.
I have not seen those films myself, although I know about them, but I would think that that's a little bit similar, about, two strangers meeting and talking and getting to know each other. And I was sort of reminded of that a little bit.
Yeah, there is definitely that connection, but I'd say the thing that sort of would set those apart is, in the Before films, the two main characters they're very, like, they're sort of hyper articulate, and they're always talking, and they have all these very lofty conversations about things. And, Johann and Anne it's often they're not even really talking about, they don't really have many conversations about, like, big issues. This is not a film we come to for, like, the stimulation of like, listening to lots of, like, very intellectual conversing. Their conversations are wonderfully kind of, ordinary sounds like it's, again, like, I think this is a problem, not a problem, but something I think about with regard to this film is that, the whole, in some ways, the whole point of the film is its focus on the lives of, for lack of a better term right now, ordinary people, and how, there's an artist whose work is featured at the museum and who is discussed sort of a few times throughout the film, Bruegel, whose art often focused on, peasants of his time, or ordinary people, just their lives, as if to say, like, their lives have meaning too. Their lives matter. Their lives are worth depicting and celebrating and acknowledging. And I feel like the film itself, by focusing on, Johann and Anne, is, and by making them seem very just real, and very kind of, again, ordinary, the film is extending that to them, and then by extension to all of us who feel like we are on this planet right now living fairly, ordinary lives, saying like, well, our lives are also meaningful and valuable, and also the life happening around us is worth observing and appreciating and finding beauty and significance in.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a beautiful way to put it. It made me think about how recently I've been getting more into poetry. I've been reading more poetry. And I find that the poets that I love the most are the poets that talk about everyday experiences, like Mary Oliver or Donald Hall or Jane Kenyon. Those are the poets that I've been reading more of recently. And I've found them to be very comforting to me. They may just talk about a tree or taking a walk in the woods, or Jane Kenyon had cancer, and she would write about that. Donald Hall was her husband, and he wrote about losing her.
Yeah.
He wrote, they talk about life and death and ordinary, everyday things. And it's not fancy poetry. It's not really abstract or really intellectual, but it's just about everyday things. And I find that I like films like that as well.
Yeah, I think it's also worth noting, that museum hours, while Johann and Anne are, of course, the focus, they make up essentially the only plot this film has to speak of. This film spends a great deal of time lingering in shots that don't advance the story at all, that don't even have Johann or Anne in them, shots of other people at the museum regarding the art, shots of the art itself. Often it will focus on little details in a painting, to sort of say, oh, look, notice this, and also shots of Vienna itself, the city, of course, where the film takes place, and not in any way, Vienna is certainly a beautiful city, breathtaking in some ways, and the film, it doesn't hide that fact. I mean, there's a time when we see Johann and Anne near these just majestic cathedrals, just these towering, majestic, awe-inspiring cathedrals. But also we see shots of like cigarette butts in a puddle in the rain, the sort of the like detritus of life. It's Vienna as a very lived-in city, a messy city, a city that's it's not trying to idealize or sanitize anything. It wants to show life in all of its kind of messy, ordinary splendor.
And I felt like the film sort of blurred reality and fiction for me, because I felt like, of course, Anne and Johann are played by actors. Bobby Summer plays Johann. Mary Margaret O'Hara plays Anne, and they're obviously actors. But I felt like some of those shots, like at the market outside when the people were going through the stuff, that seemed real to me. That seemed like, Jem Cohen just came upon it. And at times I couldn't tell what was scripted and what wasn't. It felt to me like when he was in the museum showing people, those to me came off like real patrons at the museum. It didn't feel to me like, oh, he went and hired actors. Like,
right.
So I really felt like he was mixing things, like you would just see birds or you would see things on the streets. That didn't seem like he planned that. That seemed like maybe he came across it with his camera and he took some footage of it. There's a documentary aspect to it for me personally, and then there's this fiction, this scripted things, this thing of Anne and Johann. So that fascinated me, the hybrid of the film in that way.
Absolutely, and I think that as I'm thinking about that right now, sitting here talking to you, I feel like that in a way goes back again to the art that the film, that the sort of classical art, the paintings and such, the film itself most focuses on and celebrates this artist, Bruegel, again. So the museum has, I guess, the greatest collection of Bruegel's work in the world. And, there's a scene where there's like a guest lecturer at the museum, and she talks about how, a lot of his paintings are often these kind of, as I said earlier, I think these vast crowd scenes, just these extremely, just so many details to notice, and little corners of things, just so many interactions and moments and things just happening. And at one, the lecturer herself, she says that she uses the word documentary at some point when talking about Bruegel's work. I forget exactly the phrase or the context in which she uses it, but it's something to say like, the accuracy, the way that Bruegel was attentive to the details of peasant life and was very exacting about capturing those, while also, of course, bringing out of necessity, bringing some fiction to the work to create a visual, narrative, to create a through line for the image, to craft something. But he took reality, and then crafted it into these moments to present to us through his paintings. And I think the film, similarly, in a way, you could argue, does that too.
Yeah, I remember she even said that he went undercover as a peasant.
Yes.
Remember?
Yeah.
Just to make sure that he was getting the details right in the paintings. But at the same time, it's composed, it's structured. And,
exactly.
But so you're right. He's mingling the real and the fictional. He's putting the Bible stories in there.
Right.
But then he's also just showing everyday peasant people. Yeah.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, I think I think there's different layers to this film. Absolutely. Like there's so many things going on in it.
Yeah, another thing that I was thinking about as I was watching the film this time is I also think the film is trying to some degree to deliberately connect, our lives, our lived experiences right now as human beings who are alive on this planet in this moment, to the lives of the people who have come before in decades and centuries past. So, and one moment where this really came through for me is at one point, Johann is sort of telling us, the viewer, about his younger days, being like a man, or maybe he's telling Anne. I don't remember if this is voiceover to us directly or if it's when he's talking to Anne, because there's a good deal of both in the film. But it's at a point at which Johann is talking specifically about driving a van for like small-time rock bands in his younger days, when he was sort of fumbling his way through being like a band manager and stuff. And he talks about going to, all these like little pubs to sort of intimately knowing all these like smoke-filled holes, as he puts it, in this city and this city and this city. And as he's talking about that, some of what that we're seeing on screen are paintings of like, what look to be like peasant revelers from centuries past, people dancing, celebrating. Clearly, there's music happening in the moments that the paintings capture, and it just seemed like, Cohen, the filmmaker, is being very deliberate here with his choice of like what paintings and images he's showing us as Johann is talking about this, to really show the kind of the things that I guess connect us, the things that make our experiences on this planet, or can make our experiences on this planet today, in some ways still similar to experiences of those who have come before.
Absolutely. When you were talking about that, it reminded me of a scene that really, I don't know, it got to me. I don't know if you noticed it. It was sort of subtle, but throughout the film, we don't see Janet until she is revealed to us in a very particular way by Cohen. He shows these close-ups of different faces at the museum. I want to say it might have been women's faces. And so each painting, we're seeing like different faces. And then all of a sudden, we see Janet's face for the first time when she's lying in the coma in the bed. And to me, that was a way of connecting her, I guess, to history, of saying, look at the faces of the people in these paintings. They are dead. They are gone. And yet here are their that's the power to me of art, of paintings in particular, is that here are people from centuries ago. We don't have photographs of them. We don't have films of them because those art forms are very recent. But we have paintings, you know, from the 1600s and beyond and all that. And we have these people's faces, and yet obviously the people represented in these paintings are gone. They're dead. But we have their images with us. We can stand there and look at them. And there's a very powerful connection that you feel to history and to the people that came before. And it's just shocking. I mean, I still think about like, oh my God, there were people who lived hundreds of years ago. Like,
I know.
I still can't comprehend it.
It still feels like a revelation to me as well.
Yes.
That processing of, you know, not just that there were people who lived in times past, but to the people living then, you know, the people who were alive in you know, let's say the 1600s, their lives were as immediate and vibrant, you know, to them, right,
Absolutely.
as our lives are to us right now, right? I think it's easy for us to I think to not really understand that there was passion and there was anger and there was love and there was food and wine and you know, I mean, the whole pageant of human life with all of its joy and all of its grief and all of its struggle and turmoil is something that I mean, it sounds mundane to say it out loud to me, and yet there's something about when a work of art really makes me feel that connection, as Museum Hours does. It still somehow feels like a revelation, even though, of course, I'm intellectually aware of it all the time. There's something about that, and I think it goes back again to, or, you know, at one point, I think, you know, Johann in the film says, I think it's probably at the very end, but in one of his voiceovers, he says, one is reminded of the transience of things. And I think it's that too. It's the realization, that of course, well, we will at some point be gone, and you know, and
exactly.
this, as long as we don't, you know, God willing, make the planet uninhabitable or destroy our own species with nuclear weapons or something, then, you know, I mean, one hopes that in centuries and millennia to come, there will be people who continue to live their own meaningful lives that in some ways will be unrecognizable to us, but in others will have things that do connect, you know, our lives and our time to theirs.
Yeah, I mean, these people in these paintings, these two-dimensional paintings, were once flesh and blood. They were once as real as we are.
Yes.
And I think that if you can have an understanding and an appreciation for the past and for history, I think it impacts the way you see the future too, of wanting to preserve things, for it to even have a vision of the future, to say, there's going to be people here beyond me.
Right.
And what do my actions now, how do they affect those people to come? And I think about Walt Whitman, like, he had poems sometimes where he would address people in the future. It's fascinating. Like, I saw this documentary about him. I think it was PBS American Masters or something. And they quoted him some of that, like, where he was talking to people in the future. He was talking to the people that were to come. And he was thinking about them. And he was someone who was very conscious of that, and someone who thought about these things. And I just feel like if you can understand and appreciate the past, it gives you a sense of the future. And I loved how at the end of this film, Jem Cohen, I don't know if you watched it this far, but he said he thanked his parents, or dedicated the film to his parents, because they took him to museums. It can shape you. Yeah, he dedicates the film to his parents and to Vic Chestnut. And I think Vic Chestnut was a singer.
Yes. Yeah,
Yeah.
I believe so. Yes.
He dedicated the film to them. And I think if you can take kids to museums, I know at the time they probably don't fully get it. You know, kids get bored,
Yeah.
but it could have an impact that they don't quite understand until they're older, maybe.
Oh, absolutely.
You know?
Absolutely. Yeah.
I think it affects people, and I'd really love to talk more about the power and the importance of looking in the film. I think it's a good transition into that, like, because
Sure.
that's what you do at a museum. Like, you're looking, you're regarding things, you're paying attention. And I just wanted to like mention this series. I don't know if a lot of people have seen it, but this was a really profound series in my life that made me see art like in a deeper way and made me understand it more. And that's Simon Schama's series called The Power of Art. And it was shown on PBS years and years ago. It might be on YouTube. But there's like 7 or 8 episodes. And each episode is about a different artwork by a different artist. So he talked about a work by Picasso, Caravaggio, Bernini, Van Gogh, different artists like that. And he dug really deeply into the time in which these artists lived, why they created the particular work of art. And it's just a really amazing series. And it just made me see art in a different way. And I just wanted to mention it because as I was rewatching the film, I thought of that, and I thought about how art invites us to pay attention. It invites us to look. And I really felt like that's what this film obviously does. As we're looking at this film for the second time, we're seeing new things in it. So you could even argue that film is similar to paintings in that way, that certain films invite us to also look at things. Like, this is a film about art. And so it's like, I don't know, there's different layers to it where you're looking at the film and the film itself is looking at paintings and looking at looking. I know that it sounds weird when I'm saying it, but it made sense in my head.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I love that Johann has little sort of games almost that he plays to kind of keep the games that he plays with the art to kind of maybe make his day pass a little faster. But for instance, there's one point where he talks about noticing an egg in one painting, and then on his rounds, maybe looking for eggs in other paintings, things like that. So that he's been at the museum now for 6 years, and yet he still finds ways to sort of, he still finds new things in the paintings all the time. But, there's also ways in which he looks at the people who look at the paintings. There's a stretch in which he talks about children who, come to the museum like on field trips and things, and the various kind of reactions that they can have, how they might just seem kind of bored, or, the works of art that do seem to kind of interest them, maybe the gory kind of paintings, or the really like sexualized paintings, things like that. But so it's that interesting relationship of, the kids are looking at the art, and Johann is looking at the kids, looking at the art, and how there are things to appreciate, in the art itself, but also in the experience of looking at the people who are looking at the art, right?
Yeah. Absolutely. I love the way you said that. And I think we also touched on this idea when we were noticing certain themes of how Johann he doesn't just notice the art, but he starts to see Vienna through the eyes of Anne as he's guiding her, because he really becomes her guide. He takes her around to different places, and he gets to show Vienna to her, and through the process of doing that, he starts to see it through her eyes, and he starts to rediscover it and see it anew. And I sort of thought about how by talking about this film, we're kind of seeing the film through one another's eyes as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And I loved that about the film too. Because I guess I feel that in my own life, the way that what Johann talks about, how the city is in some ways brought back to life for him through the experience of sharing it with Anne and showing it to Anne when I visit a city that I'm not so familiar with. So when I visit, say, New York, which is not city I visited a number of times, but I've never lived there or anything. And it just feels so stimulating. Everything is different. It's unfamiliar to me. And as a result, there's something, almost wondrous about all of it. It all feels like discovery. It all feels new and fresh and exciting. And, and I know that, the city I live in, San Francisco, or the Bay Area, I live in Berkeley in the East Bay, but I'm in San Francisco all the time. So, it's a beautiful city. It's a wonder, it's a city of wonders. It has astounding things. And yet there's a way in which it's become sort of familiar to me because I've lived here now for, 12 plus years. And so I don't have that same sense of taking a thrill in it that I once would have and that I do when I go to other cities. And yet I think that if I had that experience that Johann is having, of offering up the city to a friend or to somebody visiting, that it might in some ways kind of help me see the city fresh again, like, kind of see it again for the first time or something like that.
I really love how the film looks at the world inside the museum, and then it's also training its lens to the world outside the museum. That it's really mixing those two worlds of, what's inside of it and then what's beyond it, and how those two things mingle with each other. And I just really love that. And I loved earlier how you talked about how it shows Vienna in a complex way. Not all the beautiful stuff and the beautiful buildings and architecture, but the more everyday part of Vienna, the more ordinary part where people just go about their lives and take the train and, here's the different shops. And he tells her different stories about different shops and different places. And he takes her to these little bars with just working class, everyday people in them.
Exactly. They just sit in these, ordinary bars and have quiet conversations about, Anne might, Johann is certainly showing Anne around quite a bit, but Anne is also on her own a fair amount of the time. And so she'll, it's so in those moments with Johann, she can, we often see and hear her telling Johann about something she saw out in Vienna that day, and her own sense of discovery, and how we want to share. There's a way in which the moments in our lives that are just our own can often be made more meaningful or more real if and when through the act of like telling another person about them. Right. And at least that's part of what I get out of Anne talking to Johann. Those moments where she says, oh, I saw these massive structures today. What were those? And to kind of share what was originally like an experience that she had alone, to share it with somebody who she's formed this connection with, I think, can breathe new life and new meaning into it in a way.
Yeah, I love the intimacy and connection between them. It happens very organically, and it's represented very organically, where she's just at the museum one day. He happens to notice her, and I think that she asks him for directions to the hospital,
right,
where Janet's staying, and that one little conversation opens up something for them, where he says, I'll call the doctor for you because they're obviously talking in a language she doesn't know. And he offers to do that. Now, I thought it was interesting how later on he said, really, he offered that just to make sure her story was true.
Yeah.
Like, even he lives in a big city. He has to be careful himself. And he's open about that he doesn't know this woman. She could be lying, but she's not. And once he checks that out and he realizes, she's telling the truth, she's there to see her cousin, they start to just organically open up to each other. And I just, when I was watching it, the mystery of that, the mystery of why we're drawn to certain people and how certain people can come into our lives and we don't totally understand why we feel that connection with them. Or like, you've been around different people all the time, and you just can feel when you can be yourself with someone, or you can talk about things, and then you can feel with other people like, oh, I can't be myself. I can't joke. I can't say these things. And it's something intangible that you can't quite explain.
Absolutely. And that's, certainly that's one of the big I mean, that's something I spend a fair amount of time thinking about. So, I love the film for its kind of exploration of that. I think that, Johann, and I don't know, like late 40s, early 50s, I'm not sure. Johann, maybe somewhat older. It's rare and it's hard to make new connections, to find new connections, to find new friends as an adult. The older it's true, people say it a lot, I think, and I think it's true that often, the older you get, the harder it is to kind of form those connections. And I find that to myself, I come across as somebody who's very particular about other people, and with whom there's only like a fairly small subset of people with whom I actually feel comfortable and feel like, oh, I can really connect with this person. I really feel like I can be free with this person. Whereas, the majority of people, just something about them, they may be great people. It's not a judgment. It's not anything about like a person being a good person or not a good person, but that sense of, oh yes, I just can't, I'm just going to be guarded around this person. Like I can't fully let my guard down. And yeah, at one point in the film, early on, Johann is he's got a beer. He's at a bar, just sitting there by himself. We hear in voiceover his sort of musing of, what is it about some people that makes one curious, when with others one would be just as happy to never know anything about them. And that's there's no there's no easy answer to that question, but it's a question that has such a big impact on our lives, something that I almost never in one way or another stop thinking about. And I think for, at least for me, it has something to do with people coming across to me as sincere, as genuine, as, in a way that I can understand. So I feel like Anne and Johann are both they're both very kind of low-key, sincere, like earnest people. And I think that probably in some way helps them recognize that in each other, the sincerity in each other, and to connect. But I was fascinated this time by the way that it seemed to me that during their first meeting, their first conversation, Anne's face is a little more like closed off. She hasn't yet learned to kind of trust. Neither of them are fully trusting each other yet. As you said, Johann wants to kind of make sure that she's telling the truth. And I also felt that Anne's face is kind of closed off, like she's not fully ready yet to let this person in. But, later on in the film, I find that her face really comes alive in the film as she's talking to Johann.
Yeah, I agree. Definitely. She does come more alive. And I guess it's understandable. Like, she is a woman on her own in a city where she doesn't know anybody. She's going to be a bit guarded, and he's going to be guarded. But it's actually interesting how quickly they do connect with each other. It's pretty quick. I mean, before you know it, he's accompanying her to the hospital.
Yes.
And he's sitting there by Janet's bed talking about the art in the museum. She wants him to talk a little bit. Like, Anne comes off to me, she comes off strong to me. She doesn't come off like she's fragile or anything like that necessarily, but she comes off like she's just unsure of what to do. It's hard for her to see Janet that way, even though they haven't seen each other in years. I was also sort of moved by Janet's own loneliness, that they had nobody else, nobody else is there. There's no friends. There's no other family.
Yeah.
That Anne is really the only... And they just found Anne's name in an address book that Janet had.
Right.
It's like nobody else is there. And Janet's just laying there in the bed. And it's hard. Like, it's painful in a way. And I liked that the film didn't make that into a spectacle or anything. It's very respectful in the way that it shows Janet. Like I said earlier about, they just show her face, and then sometimes you'll see her hand. But I felt like when Anne invited Johann to go with her, I felt like that was a really big thing. Like, to say, will you come sit with me in the hospital? And he actually does that. I mean, some of us don't even have family who would do that. I'm not very close to my family personally. I couldn't even depend on them to do that with me. So that's a big deal to ask like a stranger to do that, and his willingness to do that right?
Absolutely, yeah, definitely. And I think that Johann understands, as the film understands, that how important connection is. And it's interesting. Johann starts to sort of reflect through his experiences with Anne. He talks a little bit about how he spends a lot of time just like playing poker online, on the internet at home alone, right? And there's definitely there's nothing wrong with that. And I think that Johann, for the most part, is actually presented as being fairly comfortable in his solitude. He's not a man who is really plagued by loneliness in any kind of debilitating way or anything like that. But I think that, I just get the feeling that he knows that he has something valuable to offer, and by being just a presence there for her, how important a presence, just another human presence, can be in our lives at times. And ultimately, what's more important than that, than connecting with another person, than offering them, something real of yourself that they might need in that moment.
Absolutely. And I think Johann says himself that he doesn't have a lot of friends, that his brother actually lives pretty far away. And I also put in my notes how that made me think about, just like you, how hard it can be to make friends as an adult. That it's just incredibly difficult. It's something that I've struggled with my entire life, to make friends, to have those connections with people. It is a very mysterious thing, and I don't know, it's just hard. And it's not like it was easy in the past before the internet and social media, but it just feels hard no matter what. Even in the past and now, and
the fact that, again, as the film kind of highlights, the fact that for a lot of people, we may just not have any interest in connecting with them or knowing them better. It just may be one of those things where this is not, we don't click, we just don't click. This is not, we're, neither of us are going to get anything out of this. So the rarity of finding someone with whom, you actually do feel comfortable. For whatever reason, when Johann, was talking about, the difficulty of finding new connections, new friends as an adult, I was reminded of, I know both you and I have read the book The Lonely City, and there's a section in there on David Wojnarowicz, and one of the quotes, and I'm paraphrasing here, I know I'm not going to get it quite right, but one of the quotes from David Wojnarowicz in one of his diaries is, it's something like David. So he's writing about himself in the third person, but he writes something like, David craves human interaction but can't stand to be around people. How the hell do you solve that? And and I mean, I really relate to that in that, there's so many people who I just find, I'm not going to say that I can't stand them or that I hate being around them, but there's, a lot of people who it's draining on my batteries to be around, right? And I can only take so much of it, and then I need to go and maybe, get some alone time to kind of recharge my batteries. And when you find someone who is actually kind of rejuvenating to be around, or who doesn't feel like a drain on you in that way, it can be something quite rare and quite special.
Yeah, it's definitely hard to find. I think the film also shows us that kind of connection and intimacy does require a certain level of vulnerability. That it requires you, if you're with someone who doesn't want to talk about themselves, doesn't want to talk about their life, doesn't want to open up or share, what can you work with?
Yeah.
But both Johann and Anne, for me, were willing to open up to each other, even though at times she'll say things like, I think at one point she said, I don't mean to pry. But sometimes I think that's the problem nowadays. It's maybe we should pry. What is wrong with prying? What's wrong with wanting to know someone? And I was thinking more about that word pry, and it's usually used when we use it in a sentence as prying something open.
Exactly.
And why shouldn't we want to be open or opened up by somebody or open somebody else up? There's just all this distance between people now, and we never really get close enough or vulnerable or real or intimate. And the last thing I want to say about it is that she will also apologize, because women, we're kind kind of socialized this way
Yeah.
too. She apologizes when she shares too much information
Yeah.
about her life, and I found myself so annoyed by that. And I was like, what's wrong with opening up? What's wrong
Yeah.
with her talking about her life? And it's like we've been socially conditioned, like, oh, don't pry, don't say too much about yourself, you know. But then
Right.
those are the very things that preclude us from actually connecting to other people.
Yeah, and of course, the truth, at least in my experience, is that, you know, when I do find a person that I feel, you know, inclined to connect with, or able to connect with, you know, it's a pleasure to have them take an interest in one's life, in me, in my life, right? And just as I find it great pleasure in learning about them and their lives, you know, and where even, you know, sometimes the most like mundane fact about a person can be interesting if you're really interested in that person. And so yeah, I agree. You know, you're right. And we are, I think, an increasingly lonely and isolated species, and that's a serious problem. It's not just something that plagues the individual, but it brings with it social problems as well. And yeah, I mean, I think we, as things like the internet allow us to connect in a sense more and more, while also being solitary in a sense, I think we as a species need to think about how we connect with each other moving forward in ways that are real and that are meaningful and you know, tangible.
Yeah, I mean, so many studies have been coming out about technology, about how it's affecting us, how it's rewiring our brain. And I mean, just in this moment, I was thinking, I don't know if you could do this story with 20-somethings. Like, I think it's interesting that Anne and Johann are older, that neither of them are on their phones the whole time. You know, they're not, oh, let me tweet this, let me Instagram this, and so on.
Right.
They're able to actually sit with each other without being on a phone. And
So,
I mean, I know we sort of make fun of it, oh, when they show a family, right? And all the kids are on the phones and the parents, and we tend to make a joke out of it, I guess. But to me, there's something profoundly wrong about a family that can't even talk to each other. And there are going to be ramifications to that. And so something also refreshing about this film was that there wasn't a lot of phones and technology, and it really was back to basics. It was like two people talking, two people walking around, looking at art in a museum. Like that was nice to me. That was refreshing, that kind of connection.
Absolutely. I mean, it is refreshing, and it is. I think that's part of why the film is rejuvenating to me, is that it depicts a real connection, you know, in a way that feels so honest and so unadorned, you know. So, you know, it just observes the connection as something, you know, meaningful in and of itself. And it's like, you know, it works almost as like a reminder, you know, in a way of how necessary that is in our lives, or how important it can be in our lives.
Yeah, I agree. Like, I mean, I even still feel like a curmudgeon for like criticizing social media, but it's like, I don't know. I think we need to be more critical. I think people at first were like, oh, Facebook's great and Twitter's great, because that was before these platforms became so massive and powerful.
Yes.
That was before the election in 2016. That was back when your mom was just connecting to people from high school, and it did seem really sweet and fun.
Yeah.
And then, but we were uncritical then, and it's like, look what happened. Look what is continuing to happen.
Yeah, there's definitely ramifications that, you know, both, again, in terms of how it impacts us individually, you know, our brains, the ways that we can or cannot connect with other people, the ways we can or cannot be in the moment with other people. But, and then, of course, by extension, the larger impact, the political, you know, impact, and so on.
Yeah. And also how social media changes how we are looking at things. You're looking at your device now and we're like inundated with images now. It's so interesting to see the museum setting. Like, I don't know, this just came off the top of my head. Like, you're viewing things in a different way. I don't know if you've ever seen John Berger's Ways of Seeing, I
Sure,
think.
sure,
And
yes.
that's what he's talking about is how art trains us to see and, things like that.
Yeah.
I mean, I saw it a while back but the internet has really, I think about this a lot actually, the way we've become so visual, but are we really looking? Are we really seeing? I mean, we're just going through these images, they're on our timeline on Twitter, they're on our timeline in Pinterest. We're seeing images constantly, but are we really looking at them?
Yeah. Like, I'm thinking about how, I mean, what percentage of people when they go to that museum or, a museum like it where
Mm-hmm.
there might be famous works of art or, great works of art, how often does a person, maybe just like snap a photo of it
Mm-hmm.
with their phones and put it up on Instagram,
Yeah.
rather than actually just being in the moment and really, really taking the time to just be there with the work and like take it in.
I think the film actually shows that. It shows people in the museum with their cell phones out. Like I remember a few scenes, people taking pictures.
Sure.
And then when you mentioned that Bruegel scene, there's a man that's like, he doesn't like what the guide is saying. He's pushing back against her at times.
Yeah.
I guess he doesn't like the idea that the biblical stories are not centered. That's something that seems to bother him. And at one time, he brings his phone out. He's like checking his phone.
That's true. You're right. You're
Yeah.
right. Yeah, I actually think that exchange is pretty important to the film as a whole. So, yeah, so
I'd love to hear more of your thoughts about it.
sure. So yeah, there's we basically join this group. We basically like accompany this group as they go through the collection of Bruegels, and we hear a lot of what this guest lecturer is sharing with the group about Bruegel's life, about what makes his work important and significant. And yeah, and she highlights the ordinary details in Bruegel's work, the way that he did not sanitize life, and I guess I feel like, to me, that man, so the man has a few exchanges with her where, so for instance, at one point they go to a painting and the woman asks, what would you say is the center of this painting? And the man says, well, I've seen the title of the painting. It's The Conversion of St. Paul. So basically, therefore, obviously St. Paul is like the center of the painting. And she pushes back against him. She's like, well, is he though, really? In her mind, she makes the argument that, this young boy who's kind of humorously got this helmet that's kind of covers, it's like too big for his head and it like covers his eyes and stuff. She argues that like visually, he's the center of the painting. And elsewhere too, there's a painting with Christ in it, but Christ is not really, in her mind, like the center either. Like there's all these people around, many of whom don't even, as she says, like spare a glance for the Christ. And so I guess what I find so kind of important about that, the way that I feel like he kind of represents a very conventional way of looking at and thinking about art, right?
Yeah.
Oh, the title says this, therefore that's what's important. Oh, it's a Bible image. Jesus is like the person, the figure in this image that we should be caring about, focusing on, and really that's what really matters. And what I think Bruegel's work is saying, or at least what the film thinks and what the lecturer thinks Bruegel's work is saying, is, the lives of the ordinary, quote unquote, again, for lack of a better term, the ordinary people in these paintings around the figure, be it St. Paul or Jesus or whoever is maybe ostensibly the quote unquote important person, that they are just as important, if not more important in some way. And I think that the film is, by focusing on people like Johann and Anne, it is sort of firmly taking a stance in favor of the meaning of the lives of people who usually are not going to be, at the center of the frame, right? But are going to be around it, but are still nonetheless living their own lives that are just as important to them as anyone else's life is.
And it was really probably radical in Bruegel's time to do that, to center
Right.
the ordinary. And then I think it's also radical of Jem Cohen to center Anne and Johann, to center these very ordinary, maybe inarticulate at times people. They don't sit around and say really philosophically deep things, but they have a sincerity and a genuineness. Yes. And there was also another resonance to me about the Bruegel scene. And that was, for me, the way he depicted suffering and people's indifference to it. That when you saw the scene with Christ with the cross, this is a horrendous moment of suffering.
Oh my God.
This is a man carrying a cross, and most of the people in that scene, in that painting, are not even paying attention to it.
Right.
They don't care. And it reminded me, it seemed a parallel to me to Janet's situation. That here is this woman in the hospital dying, a woman who does die. And I was very emotional when that scene came. I sobbed. I just broke down when Johann tells Anne that Janet's gone.
The way that it happens, it's so all he can say and all he has to say is, "Anne, I'm terribly sorry." Yep. And it's just it says everything, and it's
such a subtle moment, and there's, I think, just this sob escapes her mouth, she just kind of yelps, or she kind of, it's very almost quiet as well. It's this subtle moment, and she's gone. And they had been exploring this cave, and it's and life goes on. Janet's gone, or Janet was suffering, and life went on around her in Vienna, and it reminded me of W.H. Auden's poem, and the guide mentions it in her speech, Musée de Beaux-Arts. And I wanted to read it. I hope that's okay, because I think it deeply connects to the film, to just so much of the film, and I love that it's bringing us to this poem, because this is a great poem to me personally. So I'm just going to read it. About suffering, they were never wrong, the old masters. How well they understood its human position, how it takes place while someone else is eating, or opening a window, or just walking duly along. How when the aged are reverently, passionately waiting for the miraculous birth, there always must be children who do not specially want it to happen. Skating on a pond at the edge of the wood, they never forgot that even the dreadful martyrdom must run its course. Anyhow, in a corner, some untidy spot, where the dogs go on with their doggy life, and the torturer's horse scratches its innocent behind on a tree. In Bruegel's Icarus, for instance, how everything turns away quite leisurely from the disaster. The plowman may have heard the splash, the forsaken cry, but for him it was not an important failure. The sun shone as it had to on the white legs disappearing into the green water, and the expensive, delicate ship that must have seen something amazing, a boy falling out of the sky, had somewhere to get to, and sailed calmly on. So that's the poem, and it also reminded me of that Bruegel painting where she mentions the horse's butt. And how in his poem he talks about the torturer's horse scratches its innocent behind on a tree. Yeah. How in the poem he's also mentioning these ordinary things that are happening while something horrific is happening, that Icarus is dying. Icarus is drowning and nobody notices. I don't know, I just find that so moving. I feel like the film was engaging with some of that on a certain level.
Yeah, Yeah, I've been thinking a lot lately about the murder of Khashoggi, the reporter in Saudi Arabia. I mean, the consul.
It was in Turkey, but it was the Saudi Arabian.
Of course. Yeah. Thank you. Yes, at the Saudi Arabian consulate in Turkey. And
exactly.
The details of what was done to him are so horrifying. At least what I think is reported, or what there's audio apparently of what some of what was done. And whenever I hear about an act like that, it's this strange feeling of, oh my God, was I awake on this planet going about my life in some ordinary way? Was I sipping a cup of coffee? Was I sleeping? Was I just doing something mundane, while this act of staggering cruelty was happening? It's almost hard for me to wrap my head around at times how suffering happens and the world doesn't stop to notice it.
It's how I feel when the stuff in Syria was when we were seeing the bombings a lot, and
yes, yeah,
just all kinds of different images on a daily basis sometimes that we see in the news of horrific acts of violence being committed. And I've always thought about that since like a very young age, because I was really obsessed with the Holocaust when I was young. And I still have sort of an obsession with genocide and things like that. You just think about your life is going on while somebody else's life is being dismantled and destroyed. And, I used to think about what must it have been like to live during the Second World War. Like, knowing that these people were being murdered, and this was happening, and what would I have done? And you don't know what you would do. No. Like, all of us we're powerless in some ways. It's the things that are done by our government to other people, we don't have a lot of control over it. No. And that's always the big question. What do you do with human suffering? Like, you don't want to become numb to it, but I think Alden's poem is not necessarily saying that people are numb to it, but that people are just going about their lives, and that they don't always notice it, and maybe they can't notice it. Maybe it's too much.
We can't always notice it. We have to, to some degree, we have to go on with our lives.
Yeah.
And certainly living in the times that we're living in right now, where outrage exhaustion, is a real thing. Like, I don't have the emotional capability or bandwidth to become appalled and shocked and outraged at every new horror, that the Trump administration commits. And, just for my own ability to function day to day on this planet, like, we just can't constantly be processing the level of suffering that is taking place around us.
I think a big, powerful aspect of this film was how it embraced all the aspects of life. Like, there is the death of Janet, there is that pain, there is that grief, and then after that happens, Johann and Anne go to a bar where there's dancing and singing. And I have to say, one of the most moving scenes of the film for me was at the end, where Anne is just sitting there in her hotel room alone, and she just starts to sing. To me, that also spoke to the power of art, whether it's music, films, books, paintings, the power of art to help us go on, to help us cope, to help us survive. Like, she's turning to song in that moment. And when Janet had been in the hospital, she had found refuge in the museum and in looking at the paintings. But at the end, there's just that moment where she's by herself and she's about to leave and go back to Montreal, and she'll probably never see Johann again. I mean, I don't know.
Right.
And she's just there looking out the window and she's just singing. And that was like, that really moved me.
Yeah, and it's hard for me to think of a film that is more reflective in its impact, its effect on me as a viewer of the fact that art helps us cope and helps us go on than this film. So
absolutely.
It's very successful. It's very successful in that regard.
I know. Is there anything else that you would like to say about? I feel like we have said everything.
Yeah. No, I think our conversation has been wonderful. I just want to, I guess, touch briefly on the very end of the film, because
absolutely.
I feel like it really, again, drives home the point. I mean, I don't want to say the point. I don't want to reduce this film to being something that just has like a specific point. But, the sort of final shots of the film, it's video footage of a woman, an old, from behind of what appears to be an older woman, an elderly woman kind of stooped over, walking forward, and she starts to kind of walk up this like incline. And Johann in voiceover is talking about the image as, almost essentially as if it's a painting. He says, note how the incline just sharp enough so that we perceive the woman's determination. He's talking about the details in this thing that's actually happening, as if the way one would talk about a painting that one is, kind of in the process of appreciating or thinking about what it has to say, what it has to offer. To me, it just kind of encapsulates this film's whole perspective that we should be more observant of life around us as it's happening, and that the most seemingly, ordinary things have meaning and are worthy of recognizing and appreciating and perhaps finding some beauty in.
I definitely agree. I think that's like a really beautiful summation of the film, or a great way to describe it, really. Like, I think that's what it does as well. Well, it was really wonderful to talk to you about this film and to discuss it and to see it through your eyes and to hear your perspective about it and to also learn more about your relationship with cinema. I really appreciate that you chose to talk to me.
Well, Caitlin, it's a tremendous pleasure for me as well. I'm again, a great admirer of you and the podcast and the way that you think about and talk about film. And so for me to get to be here and talk with you about a film that I love so much was simply a pleasure. So thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. And it was such a pleasure for me as well.